On a morning in May 2007, a man named Edward was in a state of panic. His wife was about to give birth at a hospital in the city of Kurim in the Czech Republic. While she was taken into the delivery room, Edward remained at home, anxiously awaiting the arrival of his child. To keep his mind occupied, he decided to go over the final preparations in the house. The last item on the list was a baby monitor. After finishing the installation, he positioned the camera in the bedroom and picked up the portable monitor. As he switched between channels, he expected to see the empty wooden crib in front of him. However, that was not what appeared on the screen. Instead, Edward saw a child in a different location. A boy between 6 and 8 years old appeared on the monitor inside a dimly lit room that resembled a basement. The child seemed isolated, sitting alone and playing quietly with an improvised object. At first, Edward believed he had accidentally picked up the signal from someone else's camera. He watched for a few seconds and then changed channels, trying to locate his own. Still, the image stayed in his mind until it was interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing. It was the hospital. Edward went to pick up his wife and the newborn. Both were healthy and safe. Later that day, once the emotion surrounding his child's arrival had settled, Edward remembered what he had seen. He picked up the monitor again and began searching through the channels. Before long, he found the signal once more. This time, troubling details became impossible to ignore. The child appeared unable to move freely, and the longer Edward watched, the more unsettling the situation became. An adult figure occasionally entered the frame, briefly interacting with the child before disappearing again. At that moment, it became clear that the camera had not been installed to care for the child, but rather to monitor his presence. Something was deeply wrong. Edward immediately began recording the footage and contacted the police. Officers arrived at the residence, and Edward explained everything he had witnessed. He handed the monitor over to the police, who quickly understood the seriousness of the situation. This was the kind of case where every second mattered. They needed to act fast. While the identities of the adults seen in the footage were unknown, one thing was clear: the child could not be far away. Baby monitors have a very limited range, meaning the signal was coming nearby. The police began with the obvious: the neighborhood. Edward said he had never seen that boy and did not know of any nearby residents who had children, with one exception. One of Edward's neighbors had 3 children, 1 girl and 2 boys. The girl was older and already in her teenage years. The boys were younger, and Edward said he had not seen them for a long time. When asked whether the boy seen in the footage could be one of those children, Edward could not say for sure. The investigation then decided to go door to door, but it did not have to go very far. At one of the houses, officers were greeted by Klara Mawarova, aged 30, and her older sister, Katerina Mawarova, aged 32. Katerina worked as a social worker. The sisters appeared willing to cooperate and told the police that no boy or man lived in the house. At the time, they even joked that it was a girls-only residence. They then introduced a 13-year-old girl as the third and final resident of the house. Her name was Anichka Skurlova, and she had been adopted by Klara. Despite these explanations, the police asked for permission to enter and inspect the house. This request, one that would normally cause no concern for an innocent person, immediately changed the mood of both Klara and Katerina. They refused entry, saying that Anichka would become extremely stressed by the presence of police officers in the house. The officers insisted, explaining that they would feel more comfortable if they could take a look inside, and eventually the sisters agreed. The officers walked through the house, and everything appeared to be in order. The earlier refusal to allow entry clearly suggested that something was suspicious or out of place. What made the situation even stranger was finding nothing unusual at all. There was no mess, no scattered items, no visible signs of disorder, only loud music playing in one of the rooms. The officers needed to understand why Clara and Katerina had been so resistant to letting them inside, and soon they found the reason. At the back of the house, the officers discovered a locked door. It appeared to lead to the basement, a location of interest given what had been seen in the footage. The officers asked for the key, and the response was, at the very least, unusual. Clara explained that the house was rented and that the landlord had never given her a key. She claimed she had never entered the basement, not even before moving in. The officers exchanged glances, but they did not yet have the legal authority to force the door open. They pretended to accept the explanation and left the house. The investigators returned to Edward's home and asked to see the monitor again. They rewound the recording by a few minutes and noticed something important: background music. They turned the volume all the way up and quickly realized it was the same music that had been playing inside Clara's house. Moments later, they were able to hear their own voices, recorded during their conversation with her. They had found the right house. The officers rushed back to Clara's residence, now certain that the boy was being kept in the basement. And this is where the story becomes truly bizarre. This time, the officers were not greeted by Clara or Katerina. Instead, they were met by Anichka. The problem was that the girl was moving on all fours, like an animal. Appearing to be younger than 13, she screamed for her mother when she noticed the police. But instead of running toward Clara, Anichka clung tightly to Katerina's body, exactly the way a frightened child would. Her behavior was so unusual that the initial impression was that Anichka might suffer from some kind of illness or severe mental disorder. The officers moved through the house and headed toward the basement. That was when Anichka threw herself between them and the door, physically preventing it from being forced open. The officers had to restrain the girl and wait for backup before continuing the operation. With Anichka secured and removed from the area, the basement was finally accessed. As soon as they went down the stairs, the officers were hit by a terrible odor. The space was poorly lit and flashlights were needed. Police officers led the rescue team that followed closely behind, called in due to the nature of the case. Moving cautiously, the officers advanced through the darkness until they encountered a scene that would remain etched in their minds forever. Like something taken straight from a horror film, a dimly lit crib stood there, surrounded by an overwhelming stench, and a camera pointed directly at it. The officers only felt relief when they realized the little boy inside was still alive. Bound and disoriented, he was Jakub Mauer, 8 years old. While searching the basement, police found a second boy, 6 years old. He was Andrei Mauer. Both children were Clara's biological sons. They were found in deplorable conditions. Weak and cold, they were examined and treated on the spot. Despite everything, Jakub and Andrei were calm, gentle children, very different from their adoptive sister. When Jakub was lifted out of the crib, he did not cry or ask for his mother. He simply looked up and smiled. The overpowering odor forced everyone out of the basement and made room for the forensic team to enter. Clara and Katerina Mauerwa were handcuffed and arrested. The police still needed to uncover what truly happened in that basement and why the boys were being kept there. When the case reached the media, public opinion split into two groups, one that wanted Clara and Katerina locked in a basement themselves, and another that wanted to help the children, not just the boys, but Anichka as well. All three children were placed under state supervision during the investigation. Jakub and Andrei were gentle throughout the process. They were polite and constantly interested in playing. Anichka, on the other hand, was deeply disturbing. This alarmed doctors who had expected negative reactions from the boys instead, given the conditions in which they had been found. The girl refused to cooperate and repeatedly asked to see her mother Clara and her aunt Katerina. Doctors tried to determine whether she suffered from a developmental disorder or had endured even more severe psychological trauma. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Anichka disappeared. She managed to squeeze through a window that staff believed was impossible for anyone to fit through. Anichka was an extremely vulnerable child who required special care. A large search team was assembled to look for her. Meanwhile, a team of mental health specialists sat down with Jakub and Andrei. Talking to children about traumatic events is never easy, especially when the child is the victim. Asking them to relive what happened in order to describe it can be deeply painful and can significantly worsen their emotional state. Unfortunately, it was necessary to ensure those responsible would be held accountable. After many hours of careful and sensitive conversation, the police finally learned what had truly happened. The officers left the room deeply shaken, and the details were even worse than you were imagining. But before we get there, we need to understand how life inside that house really worked. Jakub and Andrei were not placed into captivity immediately after they were born. In fact, they were treated very well by their mother until a certain point. There is no information about the boy's father, but regardless, he was never present in their lives. The brothers were born into a happy environment and grew up in that small town, raised by their mother and aunt. However, their lives changed completely with the arrival of Anichka. She was an orphan from Norway. Katerina met her through her work as a social worker in 2006. Feeling sorry for the girl, Katerina shared her story with Clara. Clara was also deeply moved, and since she already had 2 children, decided to adopt the girl. Before the adoption became official, Katerina presented Clara with Anichka's extensive medical history, including treatment for leukemia. The girl required multiple medications and ongoing medical monitoring for different conditions. To make matters worse, Anichka had been severely abused at a very young age, adding even more trauma to her life. Her story deeply affected Clara and Katerina, and they took the girl in. And this is where things start to become strange. Although Clara was the one who officially adopted Anichka, it appeared that Katerina was the one who actually took care of her. She was the one who took Anichka to the doctor every week for treatment, including leukemia care. When dealing with patients who require long-term or lifelong treatment, it is common for families to develop familiarity with the doctor. Some level of personal connection is almost inevitable. However, this did not happen with Clara. She claimed she had only met the doctor responsible for her daughter once. That meeting took place at night in a parking lot, and according to Clara, she never even saw the man's face. Despite being the legal guardian, Clara was the one who received text messages and emails with instructions from this doctor regarding Anichka's treatment and care. During one of Anichka's medical visits, the girl had to be hospitalized. She became unconscious, and the doctor contacted Clara. He asked her to speak to her daughter over the phone, even though Anichka could not hear her. This was a strange and highly unconventional request, and that was not the worst of his instructions. At one point, lacking a better term, the doctor instructed Clara to perform full-body massages on Anichka, with special focus on certain areas. There is no need to specify which areas. You already know where this is heading. Katerina, being a social worker, had already met the doctor and was always present during Anichka's appointments. This gave Clara a sense of reassurance. She apparently did little more than sign the adoption paperwork. Even without understanding how this would help her daughter's condition, Clara followed the instructions and performed the massages. That was when the situation became even worse, something that would become a constant in this case. The doctor later explained that the reason the massages were not working was because Anichka's brothers, who were 5 and 7 years old at the time, were being cruel to her. He told Clara that if she wanted the treatment to work, she needed to physically punish both boys, and so she did. The punishments began with beatings with a wooden spoon and locking the boys inside cabinets. Possibly influenced by the doctor, Anichka repeated to her mother that her brothers were being cruel to her. The abuse escalated, and Jakub and Andrei's lives turned into a living nightmare. They were punished for absolutely any reason, while the doctor continued to insist it was still not enough. Somehow, he convinced Clara that the boys were monsters and needed to be treated as such, all to save Anichka. It is important to remember that the boys were Clara's biological children. Madness became routine, and the mother began treating her sons like animals. She blindly followed the orders of a doctor she had never truly seen. When the imaginary treatments produced no result, Clara received her next instruction: to apply shock therapy to the boys. Accompanied by her sister Katerina, Clara took the children to a cabin in the middle of the woods. There, she met 3 other people: Jan Squirrel, Ian Turek, and Hanna Basava. In total, 8 people were present at the cabin: Clara, Katerina, Anichka, Hanna, the 2 Ians, and the 2 boys, Jakub and Andrei. They spent more than a week in that isolated location. At night, everyone slept comfortably, except for the boys. Jakub and Andrei were forced to sleep in dog cages. They were unable to stand upright and were beaten at various times throughout the day, even without provocation. These assaults were carried out by everyone present, including their own mother. Anichka continued inventing stories about how cruel her brothers were to her, and would sometimes lie beside them, pretending she was also a victim of abuse. But for the adults, causing physical harm to the boys was not enough. They also needed to inflict psychological damage. Among the many acts of cruelty, one incident stood out. On that occasion, they gave a drink to Andrei and told him to hand it to his brother, Jakub. After that, Jakub was taken away and ordered to lie down on the ground. He was told to pretend he was dead, or he would be punished. Shortly after, Andrei was brought back and forced to stand in front of his brother lying on the ground. The group told him that the drink had been poison and that he had killed Jakub. They then said that if he obeyed all their orders, his brother would come back to life. That group made a 6-year-old child believe he had killed his own brother. Overcome with fear and despair, Andrei accepted their conditions and began crying uncontrollably. Minutes later, his brother stood up. All of this happened in the presence of their mother, who not only allowed it, but actively participated. And up to this point, this was considered the calmest part, compared to what was still to come. The group spent 8 days in the forest and saved the worst for the end. Although no explicit images are shown, the next part is an extremely disturbing account of what the boys were subjected to. On the 8th day, Andrei and Jakub were taken out of their cages. They were surrounded by the group, and Andrei was pulled forward. He was intentionally injured using a sharp object. Amid crying and pain, both boys were then forced to ingest what had been taken from him. The injuries were later deliberately burned to stop the bleeding. It is important to repeat that all of this happened while their mother watched and participated. At this point, it was no longer just about following the orders of a deranged man who claimed to be a doctor. It was cruelty and violence carried out to satisfy the group's disturbing fantasies. The boys were subjected to further abuse involving burns and forced submersion in water. However, the description already given is sufficient. These events took place in September of 2006. By that time, Anichka had been living with Clara and Katerina for quite some time, but it was only then that the bureaucratic adoption process was finalized, and something deeply unusual happened. During the process, Clara was supposed to appear in court alongside Anichka. This is done so authorities can observe the bond and behavior between the two. The problem is that Anichka was never actually seen by any authority in court. That was because Katerina arranged for one of her friends to lend her daughter to impersonate Anichka. With more predictable and controlled behavior, this girl showed the authorities exactly what they wanted to see. For a short period of time, Andrei and Jakub lived alone with Katerina, while Clara lived with Anichka. Once the final stage of the adoption was completed, the family reunited in the house where the boys were later found by police in May of 2007. Despite how difficult it is to believe, Clara continues to claim ignorance to this day. She insists she was manipulated into doing those things. Katerina, however, appears far more removed from that image. She was the one who knew the mysterious doctor. She gathered those people at the cabin, lied to authorities, and forced her sister to sign the adoption papers, bringing us back to 2007 when Clara and Katerina were arrested. Andrei and Jakub were finally safe. What stood out to investigators was how calm and positive their behavior appeared, considering everything they had endured. With the full context now available, authorities began reconstructing the case. However, there was a major concern. Anichka had allegedly escaped from a children's facility and was still missing. What investigators later discovered made the case even more unusual. Anichka was never found for a simple reason: she never existed. Her real name was Barbora Skurlova. This name may not be widely recognized, but the story inspired the 2009 film Orphan. While the movie differs from the real events, it portrays the adoption of a girl whose behavior gradually raises serious concerns, eventually revealing her true identity. The real case was far more disturbing. Barbora was 33 years old and successfully posed as a 13-year-old girl, deceiving both Clara and public institutions. Her real identity only came to light after her arrest. Unlike the film's explanation, Barbora did not suffer from any rare medical condition that affected her appearance. Investigators later confirmed that much of her personal history was fabricated. Claims of severe illness and long-term medical treatment were false. Medical examinations showed no evidence supporting those stories. Barbora had simply learned to convincingly imitate adolescent behavior, aided by her naturally youthful appearance. This led others to overlook warning signs that, in hindsight, became significant. Hospital visits that Barbora attended alongside Katerina did take place. However, authorities determined these visits were not related to serious health conditions. Instead, they involved elective medical procedures intended to maintain her youthful appearance. As a result, she occasionally remained hospitalized for extended periods. As the investigation progressed, new information recontextualized many past interactions for Clara and Katerina. One of the most surprising discoveries involved a so-called doctor who communicated through messages and emails. Authorities later confirmed that this individual never existed. Evidence suggests that both Barbora and Katerina impersonated this figure at different times. In one rare in-person encounter, Clara met a man she believed to be this medical professional. That man was later identified as Joseph Skurla, Barbora's biological father. Jan Skurla, another individual connected to the case, was Barbora's brother. A third man was identified as an associate of Joseph. Clara had no knowledge of these connections at the time. Regarding Katerina, investigators remain uncertain about the extent of her involvement. It is believed she became aware of Barbora's deception and chose to participate. This cooperation allowed access to a child connected to her social circle. Authorities concluded that the actions taken were intentional and deliberate. Barbora was the eldest of 3 children. Her mother worked in the medical field, while her father was suspected of leading an isolated group with unconventional beliefs. He disappeared during the investigation, and no direct evidence connected him to the crimes. Barbora was described as socially withdrawn from a young age, preferring isolation and spending time alone in wooded areas. At the age of 20, she met Katerina at a youth center. Investigators believe this meeting marked the beginning of a long-term plan that would later involve Clara's children. Although no official motive was ever stated, authorities believe the actions were driven by manipulation and cruelty rather than material gain. Any possible influence from extremist beliefs remains unconfirmed. Barbora's behavior escalated over time, from seeking attention to gaining sympathy and ultimately exploiting trust. Little is known about Hanna Basova, another individual connected to the case. She was 27 years old at the time and worked at an orphanage, which may explain her connection to Barbora. How she became involved with the group remains unclear. Speculation exists regarding broader influence, but no conclusions were officially reached. Law enforcement eventually located and arrested those involved. The search for Barbora, however, continued. In December 2007, a 13-year-old boy named Adam disappeared from an orphanage in Oslo, Norway. He had a history of multiple health issues, displayed unusual behavior, and appeared especially vulnerable. Adam had endured a difficult childhood and had been abandoned by his parents in the Czech Republic. Norwegian authorities launched a search, while at the same time Barbora, also known under the false identity of Anichka, was being sought in the Czech Republic. As the investigation progressed, it became clear where this was leading. This time, Barbora did not only alter her age, she also altered her gender. For context, there was indeed a real boy named Adam missing in the region at the time. This strongly suggests that Barbora deliberately identified an existing missing child and assumed that identity. Unlike her previous deception, this represented a more advanced and calculated method. What she did not anticipate was that the real Adam would be found safe just weeks later. In January 2008, investigators finally located the suspect in a city in northern Norway. She was recognized by a citizen who had seen a missing child poster in Oslo related to Adam. When police approached her, they discovered that the 13-year-old boy was in fact a 33-year-old woman. Authorities confirmed that she was wanted in the Czech Republic and arranged her extradition. With Barbora's arrest, investigators began examining her past more closely. This is when they uncovered information about Josef and the group he was allegedly connected to. The name associated with this group was De as Formigas. Very little is known about it, and it does not appear to have been large. However, members were described as aggressive and emotionally abusive. According to some accounts, Josef used techniques intended to psychologically break and reshape individuals to exert control over them. Whether this influenced his daughter Barbora remains a matter of debate. What is known is that Barbora was connected to the group, along with her brother Jan and Katarina. Due to a lack of evidence, Josef Skurla was never formally charged. He was never located and was therefore never arrested. Speculation later emerged suggesting possible involvement in illegal activities, but none of this was officially confirmed. His whereabouts remain unknown. As for those held legally responsible, the outcome of the trial brought mixed reactions. Klara and Katarina Maurova were charged with abuse and severe mistreatment. The court determined that they played central roles in the group's actions and therefore received the longest sentences. Klara lost her parental rights and was sentenced to 9 years in prison, while Katarina received a 10-year sentence. Both were incarcerated at the Opava Maximum Security Women's Facility in the Czech Republic. Klara was released in 2017 and Katarina in 2018. There is no reliable public information about their current whereabouts. Due to widespread public outrage and threats, both chose to live under anonymity. Today, they are believed to be approximately 50 and 52 years old. Adam, also known as Antic, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was an associate of the Skurla family and connected to the same group. Jan Skurla and Hanna Basova were each sentenced to 7 years in prison. Barbora Skurlova, the woman who orchestrated the events, impersonated medical professionals, fled authorities, assumed multiple identities, forged documents, and became the central figure of the case. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and incarcerated at the Svetla Nadsazova facility in the Czech Republic. Barbora was released on February 8, 2012, after serving approximately 2.5 years. Psychiatric evaluations during the trial indicated that she suffered from psychological and emotional immaturity, but did not meet the criteria for a diagnosis that would remove criminal responsibility. Medical experts concluded that she was fully aware of her actions. No clear diagnosis of a severe mental disorder, such as schizophrenia or psychopathy, was reported. Although her behavior showed signs of manipulation and emotional instability, she was released and sentenced to 5 years of probation. There is currently no public information about her whereabouts. Czech law places strict limitations on information involving minors, especially those affected by abuse. As a result, little is known about the lives of Jakub and Andrei after the case. What is known is that they were placed under state care and required years of psychological support to cope with the trauma. Their cheerful demeanor during early police encounters was later understood as a coping mechanism. Some sources suggest they were raised by their maternal grandparents, Eliska and Ladislav. The state granted them new identities and documentation to protect them from stigma and harassment. Today, Andrei is approximately 26 years old, while Jakub is around 28. Available information suggests they are doing well. Now in her early 50s, Barbora Skurlova remains a free woman, as do the other individuals connected to the case. Her current location is unknown.